Well, today we're going to look at chapter 26, which is the introduction to participles. What I've done is that I've broken participles into 5 different chapters. There's quite a bit going on in participles, and I've always found it easier to break them into smaller chunks. What we're going to be doing in chapter 26 is learning the grammar of the participle. If you can get chapter 26 down, the rest of the chapters are just nothing but forms. So we're going to hit the grammar of the participles in 26. If you can get a good grasp on what it means to be a verbal adjective, you're home free. The rest of the chapters are just how it works out in terms of its morphology, in terms of its form. In preparation for learning participles, let me just cover 3 quick things. First of all, I really hope you're caught up. The trouble in participles is that you're merging nouns and verbs. And if you're not all up on nouns and all up on verbs, by merging them in the participle, it can get confusing. So hopefully you're all caught up on your noun grammar and your verb grammar. And this is also one of the reasons why the grammar splits nouns from verbs. So you have the nouns as a discernible chunk, verbs as a discernible chunk, and then once you get your handle on those, you can put them together in a participle. And also, just let me say, don't be scared of these things. If you have learned Greek before, you might be a bit apprehensive about participles, but we've got a way to teach participles here. They're a piece of cake. And in the last several years, people have blown through participles like there was nothing special about them. So I say that by way of encouragement if you have a little baggage from a previous class. All right? So what do you have to know about participles? That's really simple. Only 3 things, in theory. One is that participles are ing words. Eating, sleeping, studying, passing. Okay? Participles are just ing words. We take verbs and we stick ing on them, and that's what makes an English participle. Secondly, and most importantly, participles are verbal adjectives. If you can get that into your head, then everything will kind of make sense in participles. Now, like I said before, because participles merge the verbal and the noun system, it's going to be kind of weird, a verb with a case ending. But if you can get it into your head that participles are verbal adjectives, and we'll talk about what that entails, but that's the whole key to participles. And thirdly, we're going to learn a few what are called participle morphemes. Morphemes are the smallest unit of meaning when you put words together. A case ending is a morpheme. The stem is a morpheme. And what we're going to learn is that there are certain participle morphemes. There are certain, actually only about 4 really, things that you stick into a word to make it a participle. So in essence, those are the only 4 things that you have to memorize. Everything else you already know. You know the verbs, you know the case endings. Now that's a little oversimplified, but you'll see what I mean in a second. What do you mean by verbal adjectives? Well, participles are words that are built off of a verb and therefore have some verbal characteristics, but they also function within the noun system and carry some of its characteristics. Okay, what do you get from the verbal side on a participle? Well, you have tense. In other words, you can form a participle from the present tense form of a verb, or an aorist form of a verb, or a perfect form of a verb. So you're going to have 3 tenses of participles. Now, what's interesting in participles, and in terms of meaning, this is very important. When you have a present participle, it does not describe an action occurring in present time. Now, if you have a present verb, it generally describes an action that occurs right now, right? That's called absolute time. Present describes an action in the present, a future describes an action in the future, okay, absolute time. Participles, and in fact, anything outside the indicative system, do not have absolute time. In other words, a present participle doesn't necessarily describe a present action. An aorist participle doesn't necessarily describe the past action. What's important in participles is what's called aspect. And what that means is that if you have a participle formed on the present tense stem, it is describing a continuous action. That's its primary significance, not time, but aspect. If you have a participle that's formed on the aorist tense stem of the verb, it is describing primarily an undefined action. And if the participle is formed on the perfect tense stem of the verb, then its aspect is perfected. Describes an action that was brought to completion with ongoing consequences. Okay, so on the verbal side of the participle, because you have three aspects, you have three kinds of participles. The participle built on the present tense stem of the verb describes a continuous action. The participle built on the aorist tense stem of the verb describes an undefined action. And the participle built on the perfect form of the verb describes a perfected action. Because participles are verbal adjectives, they not only have tense, they also have voice. In other words, participles are going to be active, middle, or passive, or deponent. Nothing new there. You would expect that from a verb. Well, because participles are verbal adjectives, guess what? They also have case, number, and gender. In other words, participles are going to modify a word. When a participle modifies another word, what's going to determine its case, number, and gender? The word it modifies, just like an adjective. Right? So if you have gune as the subject, and then you have a participle modifying gune, the participle, and let's say gune is the subject of the sentence, the participle will be nominative, singular, feminine. Right? So how do you construct a participle? Again, in theory. How do you put a participle together? Well, you start with a verb, and the verb will supply you with the meaning of the participle, right? So if you have a participle formed on akuo, it's going to have something to do with hearing, right? Then what happens is they stick the participial morpheme onto the end of the participle. You notice there are no personal endings in participles. Yay! That's really cool. No personal endings. No o, ace, a, amaneta, usi stuff on participles. But rather you have the verbal stem, and then you stick the morphemes. And basically the morphemes are nu tau, and that's your primary active participle. There's also omicron tau, which is an alternate active participle. And the primary middle passive morpheme is mena, or unless it's first declension, it goes to mene. But it's the same participle morpheme. So in terms of memorizing morphemes, you've got nu tau, omicron tau, and mena or mene. That's the actual participle part of the participle, so to speak. If the participle is masculine or neuter, those are the endings you're going to tend to see. When you switch over into the feminine, they're changed quite a bit. Aunt becomes usa, omicron tau goes to huia, and then nicely, mena goes to mene. It's still identifiable. So you may want to memorize 5 morphemes. Do you see what's nice about all the feminine participles? There's something consistent as you go down that column. They're all first declension. All feminine participles are first declension. Makes them really easy. You have the verb, you have the participle morpheme, and then what are you going to stick on the end? Case endings. Participles have to agree with the word they're modifying in case, number, and gender. The main way to do that in Greek is with endings, just like you have with adjectives. And the paradigm that is so helpful on making sure that you know what the case endings are going to be with participles is the pos paradigm. So if you're wanting to make sure on case endings, make sure you know pos. See, pos is a 3-1-3 adjective, isn't it? Masculine is third declension, feminine is first, neuter is third. Participles are, for the most part, 3-1-3 in their adjectival component. Okay, the rest of this chapter is just playing games, all right? It's just a mind game. Just say, I know this stuff. This is not hard. I know this stuff, okay? Let's say you came across the form Ballon Tests. Don't tell me what you don't know. Tell me what you do know. What do you know? Okay, it's from Ballo. It's present, right? You can see the double lambda. It's a third declension. It's going to be masculine because of the epsilon sigma case ending. It's plural nominative. What would force a participle into being nominative? Because it's modifying the subject. Right. What would make it nominative plural? The word it's modifying. Right. In other words, if you were to find Ballon Tests in a sentence, most likely you've got a plural masculine subject, and this thing is modifying it. What does the fact that it's present tell you about how you're going to translate it? It's going to be continuous. Now, what you're going to find once we get outside the indicative system in Greek, it's really hard to bring the full significance of the verbal form into English. In other words, outside the indicative, you are normally going to end up under-translating, just because English can't carry it. You'll look at this and you say, oh, it's a continuous participle. I've got to make the action an ongoing process, and then you're going to try to find some way to do it, and you're going to go, ugh, that's terrible English. That's why we have preachers. All translators are traitors, as the old saying goes. It is impossible, and you've learned that by now, haven't you? It is impossible to bring all of the meaning of Greek into English. It's impossible. You either bring a little less or a little more. Outside the indicative, you're going to have to do this more so. For example, how would you translate that? Now, what you do on participles, the first step is simply stick an ing on it. Throwing. All right? How are you going to make throwing continuous? You can say while. You can make it into a temporal clause sometimes. While throwing or continually throwing. You see the problems. You just can't say that in English. So, what you'll do in participles is you'll look and see what it means in Greek. You will do the best job you can translating it into English. And then when you teach it and preach it, you will explain that Jesus is describing not something that simply happens, for example, but it's something that goes on over and over again. There's one other character in Ballon Tests that nobody pointed out. What is that? Yeah, the omicron. There's a connecting vowel. We're trying to stay very general and broad for you, because sometimes there are connecting vowels. There's other little things that happen. But, for example, this is obviously a present participle. So present participles are formed with the present tense stem, a connecting vowel. And since this is an active participle, it's formed with the active participle morpheme, nu tau. Because the morpheme ends in a consonant, it has to be third declension, and so you have a third declension ending. Luanta. What's different? Okay, the case ending is different. You have an alpha, so you're in one of three places, right? In third declension, you still have that tau before it, so you know you're in third declension. Alphas occur in three places. Where are they? Right. Accusative, masculine, singular. Pas, pantas, panti, panta. And it occurs, right, nominative, plural, neuter. Pan, pantas, panti, pan, panta. Panton, pasi, panta. Okay? So, luanta is either an accusative, singular, masculine, or it's a nominative or accusative, plural, neuter. And the other change, obviously, is the stem's different. We switched to lu. Okay, what about balusai? The us is the feminine form of the nu tau, and you have an iota. It's not subscripted, so what case number and gender is it? Nominative, feminine, plural. Right, very good. So balusai is a present active participle, nominative, plural, feminine, from ballo, meaning throwing. See, it's easy, isn't it? Okay, here's a couple of other forms. Luamenai. What's different? Okay, it's a middle passive, isn't it? It's still formed off of the present tense stem, And in the present tense, middle and passive are identical, right? You have the men, so you know you have a middle passive participle morpheme, but your ending is alpha iota, so you know that it's nominative plural feminine. So luamini is a present middle passive participle. You'll notice in the parsing order where you normally state the mood, I'm just stating participle. Participles technically aren't moods, but it's a good place to put the word. So this is a present middle passive participle, nominative plural feminine from luo, meaning you got to make it passive and it's got to be a participle, being loosed. In other words, in English, the ing goes to the helping verb, being loosed. That's just English. Okay, what about erchomenos? Well, switch lexical forms, right? We're in erchomai. The Omicron sigma tells you it's a nominative, singular, masculine, right? The participle morpheme is mena. So how would you parse this? Think. This is a present. Yes! Oh, you're so good! Congratulations. That was the last hurdle you had to jump. Right. Why'd you say deponent? Because erchomai is deponent in the present. Cool. Give yourself a pat on the back. That's a huge thing to see, you all. Okay? You're melding your verbs and your noun system together. Good. Yeah. Erchomenos is a present deponent participle, nominative singular masculine. See, you already know this stuff. You're seeing things together that you're not used to seeing together. That's the challenge. Ballon Tests. What's the big thing that's different? You have an aorist. Now, is that aorist active or aorist middle? It's active. How come? Because of the new tau. New tau is your active morpheme, basically. Men is your basic middle passive morpheme. All right? So Ballon Tests is built with luo. Your sigma alpha is the tense formative for the first aorist. You have your morpheme, new tau, and then you have the case endings that are appropriate. Now, I'm seeing some inquisitive looks, which is good. What's missing? Augment. Guess what? Why do you think the augment's gone? Right. Very good. Very good. Augment indicates past time. There's no such thing in the participial system as past time. So you got to get rid of the augment. So we talk about unaugmenting the form. So it's not a typo. Ballon Tests is your aorist active participle, nominative plural masculine from luo. And what we'll do for the aorist is try to keep it in its most simple form. And you will say loosing. And sometimes what you can do is instead of saying while, you say after loosing if it's an aorist. But we'll talk more about that later. Cool. What's Ballon Tests? You're going to see why it's so important to have done your memory work precisely. What is that? What tense is that? Yeah, you have a second aorist. How do you know it's a second aorist? Because there's a single lambda. It looks just like a present, doesn't it? Because there's no augment. Here's where your memory really kicks in. And what I'll be encouraging you to do is to look at a form like Ballon Tests, and first thing you'll say is this the form I memorized? In other words, is this the present tense stem? Well, you're not going to know the answer to that if you haven't done your memory work exactly. We don't have nearly as many words to memorize in Greek as we do in other languages, but you have to know them exactly precisely. Otherwise, you're going to think the lexical form is ballo with a single lambda, and you're going to parse this as a present active participle, and you're going to be wrong, because there is no such word as ballo with a single lambda. But once you realize that it's ballo with a double lambda in the present, you go, second aorist, this must be an aorist participle. Lusamine. What's that? It's an aorist. You have your sigma alpha. Is this a middle or is this a middle passive? Think of what you know from your verbal system. In the aorist, the middle and the passive are distinctly different, right? So since participles are verbal adjectives, they will be distinctly different also. So this is an aorist middle participle. Dative singular feminine. Men is the middle passive morpheme, which means it's used if it's middle or if it's middle passive. That was a trickier one. You can't forget what you've learned. You're just seeing things together that you're not used to having together, but all your grammar still works. And you know that in the aorist, you have three distinct forms for the three voices. Okay? Luthentos. What's that? All right, it has to be an aorist passive, doesn't it? You recognize that it's luo, but you have the theta. Now, what's different about the tense formative? The eta has shortened. What do we call that? Ablaut. This is why I was saying back in chapter 7 that vowels shorten or lengthen or can even drop out altogether. It happens all over the place. In some forms, the tense formatives, the vowel part shortens. And so th and they are the same thing. So you have your tense stem, you have an aorist passive tense formative, no augment. Well, what's the other thing that's a bit strange? You have the active participle morpheme in the aorist passive. Get over it. What you're going to find in non-indicative systems in Greek, you often have active forms in the aorist passive. I have no idea why. Okay, look at the second form here, graphentes. What can you tell me about it? What do you know? It's obviously from the lexical form grapho, but now if you've done your memory work carefully, you'll know something a little unusual about grapho, and that is that the present tense stem and the aorist passive, a second aorist passive, are identical, aren't they? Okay, just kind of tuck that in the back for a second. What else can you tell me? Okay, the participle morpheme is neutau, which is the active morpheme, but we also know that it's used in the aorist passive. Yeah, and the epsilon sigma is what you'd expect for a nominative plural masculine. So what's the last clue in this word? It's the epsilon, isn't it? Now, if you were to see this, I imagine you might initially think, oh, it's a present active participle. Why can this not be a present active participle? The present active participle is formed with a connecting vowel before the new tau, and the connecting vowel before a new is an omicron, not an epsilon. So if this were graphentes, then you would know it is a present participle, but it's graphentes with an epsilon, and therefore the second aorist tense formative for participles is an epsilon, isn't it? You would expect that. In the indicative system, theta eta goes to eta, and in the participle, theta epsilon, first aorist, goes to epsilon, second aorist. So this is an aorist passive participle, nominative plural masculine from grapho, after having been written. Biblikatus. Okay, there's your omicron tau. It's an active morpheme. You obviously are in what tense? You're in the perfect. Beble is the perfect tense stem of balo. So how are you going to translate that? What's the helping verb with the perfect? Have. And in English, when you have a helping construction, it's the ing goes on the helping word. So it's having thrown. See? The only confusion that some of you may be feeling, and it's okay to feel it. I mean, this is weird stuff. The only confusion is that you're seeing verbs and nouns together in a way that you've never seen them before. But if you realize that's the genius of the participle, then you have all your verbal grammar at work, all your noun grammar at work, and it's just a matter of how to put them together. So in that sense, there's not a whole lot new to learn. Okay? I mean, I don't want to oversimplify it and make you feel like you're stupid if you can't get this. I mean, this is not easy stuff. But I want you to see that it's not all new, that you know all the bits and pieces. We're just putting it together a little differently from what you've seen. All right? Agapekatis. What is that? Okay, the lexical form is, it's agapao. So you have that lengthened eta, just like you do in the indicative. You have the kappa forming the perfect tense system. You have your active, your other active participle morpheme, omicron, tau, and the appropriate endings. So this is a perfect active participle, nominative, plural, masculine. There's one other thing that's a little unexpected. What is it? It's eta, not alpha. Why? Okay, it's the vocalic reduplication, but why didn't it unaugment? Because it's not an augment. That's why I taught the vocalic reduplication the way I did in the perfect. The vocalic reduplication, right, the lengthening of the vowel, it looks just like an augment, but it's not an augment, is it? What does the lengthened vowel in the perfect indicate? Completed action, not past time. It indicates completed time, and therefore, you don't lose it in the participle. Okay? It is easy. There's not a lot of new stuff that you have to learn. You're just putting old stuff together in new ways. Okay? You have to adopt that mindset.